Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 50, chapter 50, entitled Interlude 4, Watching the Ships Sail By. Kimura did not change in the weeks that passed. He still arose far too early for a healthy man. He still ate the same blandness of rice and soybeans. He still wore the same tattered clothes and still brushed the same unkempt hair. He still baked on days where his pale skin could not shield the unrelenting sun, and still shivered on nights where his rags could not keep out the cold. He still counted every coin like the next would not come. He still walked the same alleys, like they would forget him, like the rats would suddenly come to miss his presence. Kimura himself did not believe he'd changed much. The world around him begged to disagree. Hanako had offhandedly mentioned that he'd stopped slouching. Initially, he'd just passed it off as her nonsensical rambling. She often liked to throw out her thoughts to see which ones would get him to stay and chat. But then, he started to notice that less people bothered to argue with him, which was odd. He was disappointed at first. Part of him quite enjoyed the art of haggling. But now, every word came out commanding. His chest out, his shoulders back, standing at his full abnormal height. Hanako had said he was going to drive away all the business in the market. She had been joking then. Now, standing casually in front of his reflection, Kimura could see it. He hadn't realized how tall he really was, nearly outstretching the foggy piece of glass in his makeshift mirror. He had to bend his knees a bit just to glimpse the top of his head. He didn't remember having to do that before. And sure enough, the pain that was usually present in his lower back had dulled, his spine finally as straight as it was supposed to be. He leaned in, looking at himself from another angle. He could see every premature wrinkle on his pale skin, his spindly fingers reaching up to touch them. The bags under his eyes hadn't gotten any lighter, but they didn't look as pronounced anymore. And his eyes, his milky white eyes. He couldn't remember a time when he hadn't hated them. But now, staring into their bright softness, he kind of liked the look they gave him. He seemed intriguing, mysterious even, maybe just a bit ethereal too. That brought a snort of laughter up from his throat. What a silly thought. He wasn't a child anymore. He had no credit to the legends and bedtime stories his mother would recite to him. Nothing like that existed in the harsh reality of the world. And yet, here he stood, a walking contradiction, blessed with gifts beyond his own comprehension, by beings who held no name. If he existed, then who is to say the divine past emperor of Japan, descendant of Amaterasu, did not? Or Kaguya, the princess who was born from the moon herself? Or even Momotaro, the boy who fought demons and won? And if they could become legends, then who is to say that he couldn't too? A smile pulled at his lips. What an even more childish thought. And yet he allowed it passage through his mind, letting it float around aimlessly as he grinned at himself like a buffoon. Chiyoko claimed that he'd been smiling more often. Kimura hadn't noticed when he'd stopped, but there was some new feeling of lightness in his heart, something airy and soft that left his soul floating inside his mortal shell. He'd felt so calm, so untethered, in a way that left him wishing he could lie on the grass and bask in the feeling for the rest of his existence. He really was so much happier. He didn't believe someone like him would ever get the chance to feel so unabashedly happy in life. Kimura gave in to the feeling, throwing himself back onto his scrappy bed in a rumpled heap, laughing to himself all the way down, the bed's squeaky joints laughing with him. In a way, he really had given up. For as much as he woke up each day just to fight his own existence, there wasn't really any other option. He was alive, therefore he had to exist. Nothing would come of his life, but he had to live it regardless. Only the Honorable Yuki were allowed seppuku. But now, he was special. No longer was he some unmemorable existence, a life that only persisted to eat oxygen. He was someone. He was someone worthy of the space he took up. He was someone worthy of a story. He was someone worthy of a memory. Maybe he had changed. Maybe he just hadn't realized how much one simple little thought could change him. He stood up, shining blindingly bright in an otherwise shadowed room. His curtains were still drawn, He hadn't bothered to open them yet. He was no hermit, especially not anymore, but he was compelled, soothed even, by something in the darkness. Something that held him, allowed him to melt between its fingers, and promised to put him back together afterward. And perhaps it was some unconscious longing for vulnerability that left him so unquestionably all right with falling apart evening after evening. Perhaps it was something less convoluted. He didn't know, and he didn't think he ever would. Perhaps life was complex, perhaps it was not, but he didn't find himself searching for justifications for such things any more. Although, for as much peace as Kimura found basking in the depths of his feelings in some timeless existence, his poor overworked soul would always find fear in it. He fell back into what felt comfortable, the endless horizon of work, godly gifts or not, and even now, with a reprieve, with nothing to do and nowhere to be, he still found himself chasing the moon. He spread open his arms, and a wave of souls followed suit, spilling from his embrace everywhere around the room. Kimura could never see that getting old. The room lit up in a soft series of glows, much like a projection of his own luster. They danced like stars in the night sky, except these he could touch, these he could hold. He could have something so celestial in his very hands. How could he not reach the moon, when here he held something equally unattainable? The first time he was allowed to experience such awe, his first instinct was to share it with Chiyoko. If such a mediocre and bland existence like himself could find such wonder in this gift, then surely an existence of her magnitude could find so much more. But the day he tried to show her, to his devastated disbelief, she could not see it. It made sense when she tried to rationalize it. It was his gift after all, not hers. Though that did little to quell the utter disappointment that came crashing down after such a build-up. Chiyoko, however, was far too good for someone like him. Even if someone like him did happen to be blessed, she would sit on the shore and allow him to ramble on and on about stars she could not see, about the strength of souls that fought to shine bright even as others began to dim, about such lovely memories that souls would allow him to see as if they were his own, about how, despite the allure of such warm light, how truly cold souls felt in his hands. She would sit quietly and patiently as he gushed on, and at the end of their time together she would only remark that he held each soul close, if only to share his warmth with them one final time. Kimura reached for the dimmest soul in the room and brought it close to his chest, hoping it could feel the love pouring so openly from the depths of his heart before sending it away. "Look at him go," a dark presence cooed from the corners of Kimura's mind. He instinctively looked up and around before realizing who was speaking to him. "We picked such a good one." Kimura wore his flusteredness plainly, bashfully bowing his head at the below's praise. A light presence joined them, pulling Kimura's head up by his chin and brushing the hair from his face. "Of course we did." The above's voice was a sweet melody, and Kimura nearly found himself off in his own eternal rest by their feather soft touches to his skin. "We do not make mistakes." Still, despite the rather informality of the situation, Kimura did his best to remain respectful in the presence of beings he could not comprehend. He lowered his eyes to the floor as best he could, despite the above still holding him by the chin, holding his flood of questions behind his lips. He shivered when he felt a gray presence by his back, almost running down his spine. The between chuckled at his reaction. "What is it, creation? You may speak." The above let go of him, allowing Kimura to properly bow. "What is it that you require of me? How may I serve you?" The below sighed, sadly, in a harmonic low hum. "We need nothing but the time of our most favored creation." "You already work so hard." The above cupped his face in both their hands, stroking Kimura's skin in their fingers. The touch was void, but it filled Kimura's senses overwhelmingly full, as he felt his body melt. "Our poor, beloved creation. There will be nothing of you left." "I only wish to please you." Kimura felt the truths hidden in his heart spill out readily, though he made no move to cease. to prove my worthiness of such a magnificent gift." The between clicked their teeth, running their hands along Kimura's shoulders. "Foolish creation. Our choices are meticulous. Do you doubt us?" No, I could never." Kimura quickly backtracked. "What is it, beloved creation?" The above moved one of their hands to the top of Kimura's head, running their fingers through his hair and scratching lightly at his scalp. "You can tell us anything." The last word was swirled around in his head, combined with a strange fluttering feeling in his gut. He suddenly felt overwhelmingly at ease. He fell apart, melted into a puddle of raw, unguarded feeling, the truth pulled from his throat by an invisible string. He didn't resist. He allowed himself to be unraveled by one hand as he leaned into the touch of the other. Kimura cursed his own inadequacy. "I worry my own limitations will hinder the purpose you have bestowed to me. There are those who could do so much more with this gift. I wish not to betray the faith you've placed in me." "Oh, our sweet, naive creation." The below swirled around him, dancing their touches all across his limbs. Kimura wasn't sure where they were coming from or where they were touching. It was all so overwhelming for his feeble mind. "Who would we be if our faith in our champion was so wavering?" Kimura struggled to gather the last of his clarity. "But there are magnificent people in this world, like Chiyoko, who could surely give so much more to this purpose. What makes me so deserving to carry out your will when I hold not even a sliver of their greatness? I'm nothing but a scavenger." "Ah, Chiyoko. You speak much of that one." The above ceased their pets of Kimura's hair for just a moment, but only a moment, returning before Kimura could even realize they had left to begin with. "You are much too hard on yourself, beloved creation. Of course you are worthy. We chose you." "Is that what this was all about?" The between shook their head, though not without a smile. "Foolish creation. We know you'll never betray us. We do not make mistakes." Kimura felt ashamed. "I apologize for bothering you with something so trivial." "Not at all." The below forced Kimura's head back up. "For you to believe something so untrue, there must be many who speak it to you. You do not need them." But they are my family, Oka-san, and—" He tried to ignore the hurtful echoes bouncing around his mind. They love me." "Oh, poor creation, all alone," the above drawled, pulling Kimura in close. "How could they ever love you when they hold not even a fraction of the faith as we do? No one will ever love you as we do." Kimura desperately held together his breaking heart. "Chiyoko loves me, and Hanako is my friend." He winced pathetically as the list trailed off there. I am not alone." The between scoffed. "Do you forget the nature of humanity? They will leave you, as all humans do. Who will you have then?" "I am human too," he tried to justify, his voice nothing but a whisper. "And I would never leave Chiyoko." The below shared a look between their counterparts, who then stepped away, allowing them to move forward. "You are no human. You are our creation." Kimura's eyes shot up, unintentionally locking eyes with the below, but he couldn't bring himself to look away, trapped within something beyond his comprehension as the god reached for him. "You are ours." The room was engulfed in a crushing presence, trickling into every orifice of Kimura's body. He was underwater, drowning in the void, his ears ringing like they'd been popped, his mind fuzzy, like he was on the brink of sleep. He stumbled, losing his footing against the cheap, uneven floorboards of his apartment, but he didn't crash against the sharp bit of wood and nails. He fell, and he fell, and he fell, until he couldn't be sure what falling felt like anymore, losing his mind and his thoughts to something else. "Our beloved creation." His mind was muddy, and yet the above's voice rang piercingly clear. Their hand moved back in to stroke his hair, and though he couldn't tell where it was coming from, He found his instincts somehow leaning in anyway. "We will always be here, even when no one else is. We will never leave you." Kimura heard a voice in the background, small and pitiful, but it took a moment to recognize it as his own. He touched his still lips. He wasn't speaking, but his voice grew louder, overwhelmingly so, until it was flooding out even the ringing in his ears. "Please, please, do not make me leave. I beg of you. I'm sorry. I'll do better, please." Kimura turned away, blinking at the tears in his eyes, flinching when the between brushed them away for him. "Your thoughts are so sorrowful. This world is unappreciative of your existence." The between touched his chest. Kimura shivered. "We heard your cry. We responded. Now you are ours. We will not let you go." "Oka-san, please. Please do not go." Kimura covered his ears, trying to muffle the awfully pathetic sounds of his own pleas. "The world is cruel. It could never love you. What reason would it have to?" The below removed his hands, holding them captive in their own grasp, forcing Kimura's shrill wails back into his ears. "But you do not need anyone else. You have us. We will give you everything you deserve." Kimura pressed his eyes shut, curling in on himself. He didn't want to hear himself anymore. He didn't want to hear the painful reminders of how he started and where he'd never admit he still might be. "Please." This time he felt his lips move. "Please make it stop. I can't. No more." "Of course, beloved creation. We could," the above whispered, barely audible against his deafening memories. "But do you love us the same, we wonder?" "We have invested so much in you, our purpose, our gift, our faith." Kimura flinched at the harsh truthfulness of the between's tone. "And yet you speak so much of others. What of us? We are the ones with you now. Do we not deserve all of you?" Kimura's head pounded. He supposed that was true, but there were other people he cared about, too. A particularly sharp pain jabbed at his skull. But did they care about him the same? He loved Chiyoko, but her visits were becoming less and less frequent. Did she not want to see him anymore? Had she grown bored of him like everyone else had? He had someone he'd like to call a friend, but he still lived alone. No one came to visit him. Even his own mentor, the death before him, had left fairly quickly. Was he just always meant to be alone? The pain subsided slightly. If that was the case, then how lucky was he to have such company like this? "You do not need them. You only need us. But we need to hear it, beloved creation." The below still held his hands tightly, too tightly. Kimura could feel the blood rushing in his ears, his heart drumming in his chest, but he couldn't pull away. He couldn't even think the thought. It was all just too much. He was writhing in his skin. It was too much. He needed it to stop. God, please make it stop. Say it. All the contact left his skin. He looked around, suddenly finding himself alone. He still couldn't move. He was so cold, and his chest felt so empty. Say it. Everything was so loud, and yet he could hear no one but his own sickening thoughts. He was alone. He would be alone. Who else would ever come back for him? Say it. Please, please, do not go. I need you. The words spilled from Kimura's lips before he could even hear what he was saying. I have no one else, please. I do not want to be alone. All the deafening echoes of his thoughts immediately cut out, leaving nothing but sharp silence in its wake. For just a moment, Kimura was sure he'd gone deaf, unable to tell if the ringing in his ears had truly subsided. Just as suddenly, Kimura landed. He'd forgotten he'd been falling all this time to begin with. He landed in an amalgamation of hands that engulfed him just as quickly. His mind was spinning, trying to desperately center itself, wobbling against the vertigo. You are all right now, creation. He felt himself melting, sinking further into their grasp. His mind settled. Where was he? We have you now. The fibers of his being shifted, pulled in every direction. He didn't fight. He relaxed, allowing himself to fall apart. Finally, he was here. And we will never let you go. It was just some night. The sun had long set, with the glow of midnight stars and chirping crickets the only things other than Kimura left awake. His small apartment had quieted as he moved the kettle off the hot burner, though he was quick to fill the silence with a soft hum from down in his throat as he poured himself a cup of tea. It was just some night. He sighed in content, feeling the warmth of the drink through the glass. It had been a long, tiresome day of nothing but paperwork, and while he'd love nothing more than just to rest his eyes, there was still more work to be done. He sat down at his bulky, oversized desk, brushing aside the stacks of loose paper to make room for his cup. He tried to keep everything together. He still had to finish most of his paperwork in the morning, but he was done with busy work for now. It was just some night. The dim room suddenly lit up with souls, bobbing faintly all around him. He took a moment to just appreciate the sight, something about having a sea of stars right at his fingertips. It was an unfathomable beauty that nearly left him breathless. He really wished Chiyoko could see it, too. She hadn't visited in a while. He made sure to save the scene to memory so he could recount it for her the next time they met. He yawned. The soft light wasn't helping his sleepiness. He really needed to get to bed, but he couldn't save this for the morning. Despite how early he would wake, he could just do a couple, just the ones that would expire before the sunrise. That was a fair compromise. It was just some night. He opened out his hands, expecting one of the older souls to flock right in. They were always tired and ready to move on. Not that Kimura could blame them, especially when he kept them waiting for almost the full 24 hours. But that was not what happened. A bright soul settled in the warmth of his cupped hands instead. He was confused for a moment, before the feeling washed away, replaced by the smell of seawater and the soft simmer of crashing waves. Oh, a memory. He gave a small smile. He enjoyed these particular souls. There weren't many that could do this, so it was always a pleasant surprise when a soul opted to share this with him. It made his long nights just a bit easier, which was more than he could ask for. Still, there was work to be done and sleep to receive, so he brushed aside the memory and started to dig deeper. Although he missed the shore, he hadn't gone for some time since Chiyoko hadn't been there to meet him, but maybe he should pay the sea a visit, even by himself. He could squeeze it in somewhere in his busy schedule, responsibilities be damned. He froze. His cup of tea clattered onto his desk. He didn't hear it fall, but he knew it did, by the way the liquid soaked into his pants and burned his skin. He didn't scream. Not right away. His heart slowed to a standstill, the rest of the world moving on without him, threatening to topple him in its wake. His mind rang with emptiness, crescendoing to a relief it could never reach. His hands shook uncontrollably. He dropped her. His legs couldn't hold out anymore. He dropped himself. He collapsed to his knees, curling in on his wet and burned skin. His lips quivered. At the back of his mind, in a quiet echo, he finally heard the cup crash. That's when the scream exploded from his throat. A chorus of wails leaked from his lips, collecting in a broken harmony in his ears. Kimura's fingers unconsciously found their way into his hair, wrapping tighter and tighter until the pressure on his scalp popped, chunks of his ratty hair falling through his hands. He sobbed until he needed to breathe, closing his mouth only to sink his teeth into his cheeks. He pushed more and more tears out from his eyes until it hurt to even close them. He did everything he could think of to overwhelm his mind from the deep, wrenching pain in his chest, but nothing could overshadow the gaping hole that had just been torn from him. She wasn't supposed to be here, right? Surely not. Surely all of this was just a mistake, a cruel joke, a trick of his sleep-deprived mind. None of this was real. This wasn't really happening. That hadn't been her. It couldn't be her. No. No, no, no. No, no, no. He screamed against the bitter grit of his sore throat, reaching out for the object closest to him. His hands wrapped around his desk chair. He threw it into the wall. Part of it disintegrated before it even had time to crash into pieces. He had enough state of mind to tear his hands into his face rather than touch anything else. He assumed that he'd scream forever by the way the void in his chest just kept going and going, but his lungs would never be able to match the utter devastation that filled from every orifice. His breath pittered like a leaky balloon, whiny and pathetic as it died down into nothing but choked gasps. Kimura sobbed into his hands, tears mixing with the dots of blood on his fingertips from where he'd scratched his skin raw. He could see no future for himself other than wallowing in despair in his spot on the floor, so he bothered to change nothing, continuing to weep tears his body did not have. The soul floated in front of him, knowing nothing but the sudden loss of warmth and a vaguely familiar feeling. Eventually, the hole in his chest consumed him, his sights and his sounds, until it was no longer possible to tell where the emptiness of that void ended and he began. He lay in a quiet, defeated heap that betrayed the violent wretchedness inside of him. He couldn't even pull his head up to look at her, what was left of her. What worth did he have to even do that, when with all of his power, he still failed her? She was just a child. There was still so much left for her. He'd promised her so many things. That brought up a dry sob from the pit of his stomach. What had she done? Kimura clasped his hands over his mouth. God, oh God, he would never see her again. He would never see her waiting by the shore. He would never see her drawing in the sand. He would never see her grow up, hear her laugh, see her smile. She was gone. Oh God, she was gone. He would never... She was... Chiyoko! He wailed for her. Chiyoko, please, please! But the soul did not respond, floating aimlessly before him. Chiyoko was dead. He reached out for her, cradling her to his chest, trying desperately to somehow make up for his failures, trying desperately to patch the hole in his chest, trying desperately to put her back. The soul felt the warmth return. It flickered. Kimura felt her suddenly, alone and afraid. She lay stagnant, shivering under a swaddle of blankets. She was weak, threatening to collapse with each tremor of her frail body. When she coughed, he could feel her bones rattle from beneath her skin. Her lungs shuddered with each breath, forcing themselves to expand just enough to keep breathing. She withered for days, doing nothing but breathing in and out, and each day she spent alone, other than the one servant who would enter to change the cold bowl of soup on her nightstand for a warm one. Kimura had no idea how many days she'd spent like this, not when each day felt like an eternity. Her breaths grew shallower. He felt her body grow heavy. And then, she just stopped. That was it. His whole world petered out like a candle. Like he wasn't holding everything he had ever loved in his life at his fingertips and watching it fade away. His hands started to shake again as his brain and his heart fought on whether to hold her close while he still could or set her down before he inevitably dropped her. There was still so much left for her, them to do. They'd spent slow, agonizing years fueled only by their small dreams, the distant reward of finding happiness someday, one day, painfully ripped from reach. Their house by the shore, it was gone. Gone with her. They'd had a chance, small yet full of hope, and it had been ripped from them, the cruelest way possible. His lips quaked out a sob as his thoughts pulled out tears he didn't know he still had. Chiyoko. It even hurt to say her name, to allow her name placement on his lips. Please, please, if you could ever forgive a fool like me. He'd promised her so many things, and it had only taken a moment for him to break all of them. If you would allow me one last vow. Kimura held her tight, clasping his large, spindly hands around her, and yet he made careful effort not to squish her as he interlocked his fingers. He was truly a fool, leaving so much faith in the inner workings of the world to trust that they would be spared for being ordinary and well-intentioned, and Chiyoko had paid for it. He would not make that same mistake again. Never shall you have to be alone. And perhaps it was wrong to be so open in ignorance, knowing what had to be done. But again, Kimura was a fool. He had been wrong many, many times before. I will not leave you again. We shall stay together. He would gladly be wrong 1,000 times over if it meant the chance to even partially make it up to her. He was so sorry. God, he was so sorry. I will not let you go. What do you mean, creation? Kimura lurched his head up, instinctively spinning around as the below's voice settled in his head. He was unprepared to find them all peering over him, swallowing him in their might. He couldn't help but stare pointedly into their gaze, finding a way to meet each of them in the eye. Unexpectedly, he found his heart pounding with fear. Surely you do not mean... The above feigned a gasp, trickling into a disappointed sigh. You have betrayed us already. After all the trust we have placed in you, you choose still to break the rules that have been set. Surely it cannot be. Kimura reached out. No, I did not. I just... He glanced down at Chiyoko in his hands. She is... dead, the between snapped. It is dead and awaiting judgment, like all that have before and all that will forever. Then they slouched with what looked to be some frustration, hanging over Kimura with a sharp, narrow gaze. I believed you would be different from the ones before. I should have known you were all the same. What? But you said... He was special. He was. They had said so. They had said he was full of purpose and value. They had chosen him for a reason, and yet he had still... Kimura looked back down at Chiyoko, her light just faintly dimmer than before. He felt his heart split in two, neither half of which belonged to him anymore. Please, he begged with wet pity. She is just a child. The below drifted forward. So were hundreds of others you received and have released, none of which elicited even half as much of a reaction from you as you seem to give now. They huffed, turning their back. I had admired your dedication, but it seems to have been masking nothing but selfishness. The below moved away from Kimura and back to the others, leaving the space suddenly cold and empty. He hadn't realized. Had he always been so unfazed by the sheer loss of life that passed through his hands? He thought he'd been doing okay. He was patient when they wanted to share. He leant over the warmth of his human hands, but he'd never cried for one until now. He didn't know one until now. Was that wrong? Chiyoko was his sister. He loved her. Was it really selfish to be in this much pain? Oh, creation, where have you gone wrong? The above grieved dramatically, catching Kimura's harsh wince. To break our hearts purely for your own greed. I did not think it could be so. He didn't mean it like that. He didn't mean to hurt them, not when they took such good care of him, despite the fact that he probably didn't deserve it. He didn't deserve any of their consideration, especially not anymore, just in the same way he'd never deserved Chiyoko, despite the way she always valued him. He knew someone like him was never meant to feel the way that he had, but he was pathetic and human, and could not let go of things that made him feel so warm and whole. He was undeniably human, self-destructive and foolish, and neither could he escape the truth that the crumblings of all that had ever mattered to him was undoubtedly his own doing. He was sickeningly human, to know that his ethereal greed would rob him of all that never belonged to him, and wanting it all regardless. Tears slipped down his face, but he couldn't feel sorry for himself. How could he, when there was only this real end for all of his decisions, and he had proceeded anyway? The below moved to console the other, leaving Kimura to destroy himself. We sacrificed so much of our faith in choosing you as our new creation. To think we would be rewarded like this for giving you the chance you would have received nowhere else. It was true. He was an awful, disgusting human being. They had given him so much, and he'd gotten it into his stupid little head that losing his mortality had made him immune to the fallacies of humanity. He loved Chiyoko more than he could ever love himself, but even the selfishly human thought of keeping her around when he had to let her go had cost him everything. Of course he disappointed them. That was all he was good for. Kimura used his hands to cover the shame on his face, dropping Chiyoko to the floor. The soul rolled across the hardwood, knowing nothing but the sudden loss of warmth and a vaguely somber feeling. Please forgive me, he wept, unable to look at their crestfallen gazes any longer. I beg of you, I'm sorry. I will do better, please." Finally, one of them, the between, approached, wrapping around him, hands clamped onto his shoulders, breath slithering through his ears and down his neck. How we wish to believe that, creation, but how can we, when with the same breath you promised that you would only need us? The gods turned between each other, and then collectively to the thing on the floor. "Prove it," they called. Kimura flinched as they swarmed him, the air becoming hot and overwhelming, sizzling his tears before they could even roll all the way down his cheeks. His heart thundered in his chest as he tried to ignore the way the fear pumped through his blood. "Give it to us. Relinquish your control. We will decide where it goes." Their voices melded together into one synonymous chord, alluringly haunting. "You can still fix this. Reinstill our faith. Prove that we are all that matters." "Give her," he repeated dumbly, the words oozing from his mouth, sticky like marmalade. The charm faded, and all that was left was eerie dissonance. "You hesitate." The gods grew closer. Kimura shrank back. He trusted them. He did. He really did. So then why did he feel such fear looking into their eyes? I... He reached for Chiyoko. "I am not..." Why was he afraid? He shouldn't be afraid. They believed in him. They'd trusted him. Why did he feel so afraid to trust them back? They were only doing their duties. Why couldn't he do his? Chiyoko couldn't stay with him, regardless of how much either of them might have wanted that. This was what was meant for her. This was what was best for her. He really was a selfish fool, trying to change that. How could anyone not be disappointed with him? Chiyoko would be safe with them. She would be. He was safe with them. She would be too. He looked down at her, but all he could see was his still shaking hands. He did not look longer than he had to. Kimura glanced upward. He did not have to move. He had already been circled. 3 sets of eyes precariously settled on his next move. He tried to ignore the phantom teeth set into his neck. He held her out to the above specifically, a desperate, somewhat defeated look in his eye. "Please. Please take care of her. She is a good child. She is all I ever had." The god snatched it out of his hands. "We knew you would come around, creation." The air got tight. "What a good listener. You're perfect for us." The world started to spin. Kimura tried to focus. His head got fuzzy. "You have wronged, but we forgive you." A soft smile rose against his tears. His heart battered weakly against his rib cage. Everything gave out. "Thank you," was all he managed to sputter. Kimura lost consciousness before he hit the floor. No one bothered to catch him. Time passed. Kimura hadn't even realized he'd passed out until he found himself waking up alone on the hardwood floor, a dull, all-consuming ache at the back of his head. Immediately, he wished he hadn't. Time passed. He hadn't found himself crying as much as he thought. He hadn't found himself doing anything as much as he thought. His mind plagued him every waking moment, occupied with more thoughts than he could ever hope to process. He was haunted with knowledge in a sickeningly familiar way, tormented instead by things he understood, but could do nothing to rectify. He slept often, more than he had even before he started working. It was the only time his thoughts offered him even a sliver of merciful reprieve. He dreaded waking up, the low hum at the back of his mind of all his thoughts waking up with him. But time passed peacefully while he slept. What else was he expected to do then other than sleep? The only thing he dreaded more were the moments just before sleep, where there was really nothing to distract him from the truth he was desperately trying to escape. Time passed. He'd always been lonely. Maybe that was his fault, too. It's not like he went out of his way to find people to fill that gap. He'd had people at some point, at least he figured he did. Kimura didn't think it was possible to miss nothing. But Chiyoko had always been the thing to smooth it over. She had single-handedly staved away the loneliness that aided him day after day. He didn't need anyone else because he had her. Maybe this new, intensive, unrelenting loneliness was his fault too, because who else could he blame for the void that threatened to swallow him whole? He had placed everything into the small doses of happiness he'd found with Chiyoko, and never had it once crossed his mind that the feeling could somehow be taken from him. But that could be no one's fault but his own. He'd never been smart. Of course he couldn't see the consequences of his own stupidity. The only thing he'd ever been right about was the fact that he was a fool. And that wasn't even his own original thought. Kimura cried selfishly for himself, until the sweet release of exhaustion allowed him to sleep once again. Time passed, and all he could bring himself to do was wake, work, and sleep to varying degrees of regularity. There existed no constants in the limbo that housed him, save for the fact that no one, nothing, ever came to check on him. Maybe part of it was the bottomless pit he managed to fill with loneliness, or the comically villainous levels of stupidity he'd never managed to grow out of, or the drunken ramblings of guilt fermenting in his heart like a persistent hangover he couldn't manage to pass. Maybe it was some twisted cocktail of all three. Maybe it was none at all. Maybe it was something else entirely that he'd never be able to place. He would probably never know. But time continued to pass until he suddenly woke up to all the things he was trying to escape. It was still dark when he put on his overcoat and left his house for the first time. He walked alone, with nothing but the fading glow of the stars and the nippy night wind to accompany him. He walked and walked until the sun rose and planted itself high in the morning sky. In hindsight, he should have taken the trolley at least part of the way there, rather than walking for hours on end. In hindsight, he probably should have never gone there in the first place. But one of the many things he lacked was intelligence, and he'd known that all of his life. He wasn't going to start denying it now. It was nearly noon when he finally reached the front gates of the Yuki estate. It was just as tall as he remembered it, dark wooden planks stretching even past his unusual height, the slightly weathered grain hidden from all except his perpetual memory. The awning overhead casted him and the set of gates in shadow, and the foliage around closed him in. Kimura's shoes felt rooted to the ground, and despite the fact that he'd brought himself here, he neither felt wanted nor welcome. The brass knocker seemed to mock him, taunting him to dare rust it with the grime from his hands. Kimura sucked in a breath and rapped a hard 3 times with a white-knuckled grip. There was a painstakingly long moment of silence, though not as long as he expected, before he could catch the sounds of clicking just over the howl of the wind. The antique lock behind the gate heaved, and the gate was cracked open slightly with a heavy groan. A small woman, in a plain kimono, peeked through the gap. "Hello, and welcome to the Yuki—" Her voice petered out as her eyes drifted up to land on him. She took a step back, raising her hand to her mouth. "Hirotaka-sama?" Kimura winced. He hadn't heard that name in a while, much less like that, but he couldn't blame her. She was just a servant. It's not like father ever bothered to share much with them. He was interrupted by another presence calling out from behind the gate. "What is taking you so long? Who's at the gate?" Another female servant moved into his line of sight, her face falling the same way as the one before. The first servant turned to her with a hushed whisper. Can we even allow Hirotaka-sama inside?" "Do not refer to him as that," she scolded back. "You should know that." "How then do you suppose we refer to him?" "I go by Kimura now, if that would suffice." He interjected their squabble, causing both ladies to look back at him. "If you would please allow me inside, I'm here to speak with Erin-san." They all collectively hushed at the name. Like merely speaking the syllables was taboo in itself. For the servants who could not speak his first name, it was. For Kimura, who could not speak his name at all, it was also. "Yuki-sama will not want to see you, you know that," the second servant bit with an unprofessional harshness. "You should leave, Kimura-san, before you cause yourself more problems." She began to close the gate. She was right. Kimura was smart enough to acknowledge that, but he was not much smarter, as he instinctively shoved his foot in the way. "I need to see my father. It is not a matter up for debate." he commanded as if he held any real power. Still, the two women before him shivered under his towering stature and equally intimidating gaze. "If you cannot let me in, I will take it upon myself to let myself in." "Let yourself in? What are you, a fool?" the second servant gasped, still standing her ground, blocking the entryway. "Even you must understand the consequences behind that." Kimura had to remain calm, if not a bit stern, hoping he could channel some of the Yuki's regality back into himself, but hearing himself be called a fool by someone other than his own mouth and thoughts erased all chances for diplomacy. He was reminded how truly far from a Yuki he was, as his skin flushed with hot anger and his eyes gave away all his inner turmoil. "Consequences be damned. This is not about him." "Kimura-san." The first servant interjected herself physically between them, pushing the other woman behind her and placing her own hand on the gate, opening the gap a bit further. She looked up at his harsh gaze, and yet found herself feeling nothing but pity, rather than the fear of the servant behind her. This is something you need to do." Kimura softened. "Yes," he replied, like he hadn't spontaneously walked here this morning. She nodded. "Then I suppose we best let you in." She pushed open the gate completely, allowing Kimura to step onto Yuki land for the first time in a very, very long time. He'd dreamed of this moment every night he'd spent cold and alone in his apartment, but the reality felt just as cold as all those nights had before. He didn't belong here. He probably never had. Still, he took a second step forward. "I suppose we will not have to wait long for Yuki-sama," the first servant remarked, looking around as she led Kimura to the main building on the estate, the second servant trailing behind them. Many of the other Yuki estate servants had gathered outside, likely due to the commotion at the gate, whispering amongst themselves with less than subtle glances towards him. And Kimura really couldn't blame them. Here he was, on land he never thought he'd step foot on again, towering above the two women with him despite his slouch. His wispy white hair fluttered in the breeze, his skin pale like ash, and yet worn with stress and suffering. His eyes were gray and sunken, hidden from view by the shadows that claimed his face. He must have looked disgusting, terrifying even, much like the malicious spirits of stories they'd all been taught to fear. With every step, he could almost see the dirt from his shoes stain the stone pathway beneath him. The servant was right. They didn't have to wait long at all, because just as she approached the door to the main building, it flew open, nearly knocking her to the ground. In the doorway stood a portrait of a man so pristine Kimura could have believed it walked straight off his wall and met him here. His royal ebony hair draped smoothly over his shoulders in all its length, not a strand out of place, out of the usual oiled hair tail reminiscent of his samurai days. He wore a regal, formal kimono pressed to perfection, lying effortlessly upon his shoulders without even a wrinkle, his rich brown eyes magnificently deep, like the expanse of the night sky, pierced through the very air like the bite of his blood-stained tanto. Even the rigidity of his stern expression matched the painting 1-to-1. The only difference he could find between reality and the collection of paint strokes that hung on his wall was the cane gripped tightly in his hand. Still, the man, Yuki Eirin, the head of the Yuki household, stood like a mountain, and like a mountain's own peak, the air around them chilled as soon as his eyes landed on Kimura. "You are truly a fool to show your face here again. Which of you dared to let him pass the gate?" Eirin jabbed his cane at the two servants standing in front of Kimura. "You?" The servants flinched back. Kimura found himself quickly stepping in front of them. "I did not need anyone to let me in. I pushed my way in like the brute I am." Kimura straightened his back, allowing himself a bit more imposing height. Still, his sad, submissive eyes could never betray him. "It is no one's fault but my own." Eirin grumbled, stepping closer. "Of course it is. It always has been. It is a shame that someone as pathetic as you was born from this blood. I wish I had not been there to witness your conception myself." Kimura lowered his head, trying to ignore the way his words began sinking in his chest like a stone. "Father, please." Eirin raised his cane. I am not your father, you pitiful excuse for flesh and bone." The servants who had let Kimura in immediately fled for the safety of the audience distance, as Kimura himself instinctively dropped to his knees, shielding his head with his lanky arms. "Please, I do not wish to fight." "You could not, even if you wished." He moved closer, still with his cane poised high above his head. "Even if all your moronic brain did learn was brutism, your wretched body could not compare to even a dog." "Please, You are good for nothing. No scholarly man would feel pride to counter your argument. No honored man would feel victory to slay you on the battlefield. No typical man would feel pity to see you begging on the street." Kimura dug his fingers into the dirt he knelt in, if only to keep them from clawing into his own sides. "You cannot even grovel at my feet in any meaningful way." "I came to say goodbye." So desperate to keep his weakness behind his eyes, Kimura could not stop the words that broke from his lips and echoed around the estate. His voice cracked in a juvenile way, and his tone betrayed his hopeless attempts to seem more polished than he could ever truly be. He must have looked pathetic, with his ratty hair and his reddened eyes and his deepened bags. He must have looked pathetic, and yet he would regret none of it, if somehow his complete and utter despair managed to spark even a sliver of shriveled pity in his father's heart. Erin faltered, and even if it was clearly more confusion than pity, Kimura latched onto it like a lifeline. "I know I have no place here, especially not without Chioko, but His mind reached back to that night, and Kimura flinched deep into his soul, regret bubbling in his stomach that he'd missed the chance then. "I just cannot bring myself to move on, knowing there are things I never got the chance to say, even if she cannot hear them. They ache as they stay with me." He looked up hesitantly, and for the first time in his life, Kimura found something he shared with his father, an immeasurable sorrow that ran far past where the eye could see. "Chioko," Erin mumbled, setting his cane down to balance himself. "Please, I ask for nothing else ever, and I will give you anything in return. If you asked for my life, you would be free to take it." Kimura begged, the one skill he had. "Please, just allow me to pay my respects. Please let me tell her goodbye." The whispers from the servants around them died down, and Kimura was left to bask silently in the grief of his woes. His father did not respond right away. His face was unreadable. Kimura hoped that he was at least considering his words. But then, Erin's mouth twitched and settled back into the frown from before, a painfully familiar revulsion pouring from his eyes. "How did you know she was dead?" Kimura's heart dropped. "What?" "That information was kept within this estate." His thoughts flowed into his speech before he even had the chance to process them. "When my beloved daughter passed, it was clear no one outside the estate was to be informed. Only servants picking up items for the service were allowed to leave, and they were accompanied by my guardsmen." He stepped forward. Kimura instinctively shuffled back. "I ask again, how do you know? Do I have traitors within my estate who no longer respect the finality of my word?" The servants around them immediately flinched and huddled around each other, cowering from their master's bite. Kimura frantically shook his head. "No, I was not told." "Then how?" He swung his cane up. Kimura resigned to guarding his head. How could he hope to explain that he held Chioko's soul within his dirty, worthless hands? Just as suddenly, Erin lowered his cane just a hair, his old body going slack as his mind finally pieced it together. All the days she would return to the estate late. It was not because her piano teacher kept her after. Kimura reached a hand out, desperate to salvage something from the crumbling disaster around him. "Father!" Kimura screamed in agony as his father's cane connected harshly with his wrist, the audible crack of wood and bone echoing throughout the estate. "It was you!" Kimura clutched his hand to his chest, but could do nothing else as Erin finally closed the gap, towering over his prone form. "You were the reason she stayed out. You were the reason she grew ill. My beloved Chioko is dead. Of course it would be because of you." Kimura shook his head desperately. It couldn't have been him. He'd always been so careful with her. She never looked ill the last few times they'd met. He'd always seen her off specifically to make sure she was all right. It couldn't have been him. It couldn't. "You would give me your life. What a worthless thing to offer. I should take something of equal value from you for what you have done to my beloved Chiyoko, but you have nothing that would ever cause you even a fraction of the grief that I feel. Not even your life is worth anything close. Can we please just talk for once? Kimura screamed back, tears streaming down his face, forced out of his body by the boiling overwhelm that consumed him. Chiyoko was my sister. Why would I do anything to even risk her well-being? I loved her. He didn't even get the chance to scream this time as the cane connected with the side of his head, sending him reeling onto the dirt. He lay limply on his side, unable to focus his vision, as all he could register was pain and the sticky warmth of something by his face. Half-sister, you insolent wretch! Do you think I would even bother with another child from your mother when the first thing she birthed was you? Kimura didn't have the energy to even react as he felt the cane come down on him again, but his body seized up regardless. Tears mixed with his blood and stained the ground beneath him an ugly maroon, the color of his heart as it weeped out of his chest. My sister, he gasped for air like a fish out of water. I love her. He was vaguely aware of his head wound and tried to reach his uninjured arm up to quell what had to be the source of his bleeding, but his arm was swatted away by the cruel bite of his father's wooden cane, rendering it limp and useless, just like the rest of him. His vision fuzzed, staring out at nothing as the cane came down over and over on his helpless form. You are worse than worthless! The cane cracked against his unshielded ribs. I should not have even waited for your hair to turn to know. The cane shattered one of his kneecaps. I should have had you terminated before you were ever born. What did I expect from a woman cursed by the Yurei, to not produce a child of the same? Kimura tried to shake his head. His mother wasn't cursed. Her white hair wasn't cursed. She had just been poor and overworked and tired and sad. That wasn't cursed. Even as she passed her white hair down to him, that wasn't cursed. He shook his head. He tried to explain. Erin saw the movement. The cane came down again. You are nothing but a plague on this family. On my name. I gave you a chance to fester, and I have paid dearly for it. The doorway to the main building was in his line of sight. That was the only reason he managed to notice the movement in his current state. Someone stood there, watching, just as all the servants surrounding them stood and watched and did nothing. He knew her. She looked familiar. He recognized that awful black wig she wore to hide her white hair. Kimura called out for her like a child. Mother! He only saw her turn away before everything went black. Kimura woke up in an unfamiliar place. The first thing he registered was the lamp at his bedside, giving off a soft glow that he still flinched away from. The second was how much pain he was in. He groaned loudly, his bones creaking along with him as he tried to sit up and open his eyes. Oh, please do not try to move. A man rushed over to his bedside, grabbing one of his arms to try and steady him. You are still healing. As his fingers closed around his skin, Kimura remembered everything. His eyes snapped open as he pulled instinctively against the grip of the man, fear rushing back through his blood. He glanced around frantically, looking for a gap in the crowd of servants so he could at least try to escape, for the incoming strike of his father's cane so he could at least try to move out of the way, for that awful black wig he knew so well so he could at least try to beg for mercy. But as he looked around, he found none of that. He found himself in a small, unassuming room with little more than a few shelves and side tables. He found himself on a bed with a blanket rumpled at his waist, just a bit softer than his own. He found the man next to him with concern in his eyes and nothing more, and with each new thing that Kimura found, he calmed, until his breathing was steady and his blood stilled. The man released him soon after, seeing that he had come to his senses. You jostled some of your wrappings. I will have to fix them. Kimura could only find the energy to stare as the man stood to grab a roll of bandages from one of the shelves, his brain sputtering back to life. What happened? He stopped himself. That was a dumb question. Where am I? He returned to his bedside. You are in the local clinic, which also happens to double as my home. The man, no, the doctor, began unraveling the skewed bandages on one of his arms. Some locals found you on the outskirts of town, barely breathing, and rushed you over to me. You were quite lucky they did. I'm not sure you were going to wake up, much less survive your injuries. I imagine we would not be having this conversation if they'd gotten you here a moment later." Kimura did not respond. He hadn't tried to test out his supposed immortality yet, but he was more than sure that that was the reason he'd stayed tethered to this plane. Somehow he found no happiness in that truth. Somehow he found less than the absence of happiness. He had been dumped, discarded like trash. He knew he was nothing special, less than that even. But still, his heart ached to know how crudely he'd been thrown away. No one on this earth wanted him. Even worse, no one on this earth had ever loved him at all. The worst of all, the one person who'd ever cherished him was gone, locked behind a gate he could never cross. At least, not for another century. It all hit him at once. Lucky. Him? He was quite possibly the most misfortunate being in the world. The doctor moved to rewrap his chest. Kimura winced at the touch. "Apologies, though it is quite odd how quickly your skin seems to have healed from the bruising and lacerations. I cannot say anything about the internal injuries, but if they've healed anything like your skin has, I would say you'd be ready to depart by the morning." The doctor paused, shaking his head in disbelief. You really should be dead. What a lucky man you are to have been so blessed by Kami-sama." Kimura pressed his eyes together tightly, wishing so desperately for him to just stop saying that word. The doctor frowned slightly at his reaction. "Apologies again. I forgot about your head. I will try to keep my voice down." Kimura wished he would just stop talking instead. Immediately he found himself aghast at just how ungracious his thoughts were to the man who had technically saved his life. Then, just as quickly, he suddenly couldn't find it in himself to care. "Do you perhaps remember what happened to you?" The doctor spoke carefully. "You were beaten quite badly. Whoever did this to you might attack someone else." Kimura almost laughed. Kimura almost cried. Instead, he shook his head with as painfully blank a face as he could muster. "I guess that is to be expected with your head injury." He sighed, moving his hands to the bandages wrapped around Kimura's head. Kimura flinched again as his white hair was brushed out of the way, let loose from its usual updo. You do remember who you are, correct?" Kimura wanted to nod, but he couldn't without disturbing the doctor's work, so he cleared the raspiness from his throat the best he could, pursing his dry lips together a few times until the feeling stopped bothering him. "Yes, I remember everything important." "Well, I would argue that the memory of what left you in such a dire state is also important. But it is good that you're at least not suffering from any long-term amnesia." The doctor finished checking his head, setting down the roll of bandages on the bedside table. He reached over the bed to lower the glow from the lamp, and Kimura felt genuinely thankful for the first time since he woke. "For now, I would recommend you try to get some rest. I'll bring some tea and supper once it finishes." The doctor stood up, making for the door before his steps slowed. "I am sure your family must be extremely worried about your absence. Is there anyone I can notify for you?" Kimura sank into himself, laying his worthless body back down on the bed. He pulled the covers up to his neck. "No." Time passed. The doctor had been correct in his assumption. Kimura had been fit to depart just that morning after. Again, the doctor had insisted that someone, distant family or even just a friend, stay with him for the days after, fearing a sudden relapse of his injuries. Again, Kimura had insisted that he would manage on his own, and the doctor understood what he meant. Kimura could see the disagreement hiding behind the doctor's eyes. He'd always been good at noticing things like that, but he relented. The doctor sent him off that very afternoon, though not without more than enough coins to take the trolley home. The doctor was a kind man. Kimura did not feel much from his kindness. Time passed. Kimura hadn't even bothered to check if he still had his keys before reaching the entrance to his shop. Thankfully, he found them in the inside of his tattered and bloody overcoat. The doctor had offered him spare clothes before he left, and while Kimura had taken the new slacks and shirt, he couldn't find it within himself to part with his coat. He didn't know why. The thing was old and ratty long before Kimura had ever donned it. There was no significance to it, none before and none now. But something about its oversized fit how it completely engulfed him, almost as if it were eating him whole. It made him want to sleep forever. Kimura wished he could. Kimura did not open the shop that day. Retreating hastily for his apartment upstairs, he told himself he would open it tomorrow. Tomorrow came. He did not. Time passed. Kimura did not take off the coat, no matter how he worsened the rips, no matter how his own blood stains on it darkened to the color of mud. He slept in it. He ate in it. He would have bathed in it, but Kimura hadn't even bothered to bathe since returning home. He did not take off his coat, no matter how he blemished it with his stray tears that escaped him. They did not escape him often, but somehow the dim wet spots were the worst thing he found when he looked at his coat in the mirror. He did not do that much either. He did end up taking it off eventually to fix it. He would have preferred it never to leave his body, even if that meant it dissolving into nothing but shreds of thread upon his bones. But when the collar inevitably ripped one morning upon his awakening, lying flat on his shoulders, unable to be propped up to his neck, it caused him more distress than he anticipated, more distress than the thought of taking it off. So he took it off, adorned still in the clothes that the doctor had given him. He decided he might as well clean it while it was decoupled from him. He did not look in the mirror above the sink as he scrubbed away his own blood, careful not to rip it any more. He instead looked at his bony arms exposed by his rolled sleeves. He still had the bandages wrapped around his forearms, despite knowing he should have changed them by now. His wet hand reached out instinctively for the end of one, but as soon as the pressure around his arm changed, his hand flinched back. Kimura resolved to finish fixing his coat instead. He stitched the rips and tears himself, albeit a bit crudely with his lousy sewing kit. He could have gone and had it fixed by a seamstress, regardless of how he may have been looked at, to request fixing such a disgusting garment, but he did not want to leave his apartment. Really, he did not want to go outside. So he fixed his coat himself. It wasn't perfect, but his collar stood up as it used to, so it was fine. He slid the coat back on, but the sleeves must have tugged the bandages on his forearms. The bandages should have stayed firm, but they must have loosened from the water. He felt them slide down his arms and flutter out of the cuffs on his sleeves. His bare skin touched the inside of the coat. Kimura suddenly yanked the overcoat off him, panicking at the once calmly restrictive feeling around him. He pulled off the shirt that the doctor had given him. He heard it rip at the back of his mind. He wouldn't be fixing it. He could see his arms now. They were as pale as they'd always been, dotted with nothing more than some dark shadows, almost unnoticeable unless he was looking for them. But he was, and upon finding them, they burned as they had that very day. He could feel the heat from the welts return, pain sinking far past his mangled skin and deep into his bones. Kimura clawed at himself, his overgrown nails drawing blood once more. He managed to rip the bandages around his chest in his frenzy, and those wounds reignited too. And for the first time since time had passed, Kimura screamed. He wailed from a pain that stretched far past his physical wounds. He broke down into pathetic sobs, collapsing to the floor in a mangled heap. He cried for many reasons, for people he had cried too much for people he should not have cried for things he wished had happened, for things he wished had not. He cried until he ran out of tears to cry, and yet his body hiccuped and sobbed without him. Kimura wished one of the blows had struck his heart, even if it would not have mattered anyway. Time passed. Kimura found himself sitting by the window often after that, staring past his haunting reflection and out to the world around him. He watched people move on with their lives and wondered if one day he might do the same. He wondered if he wanted that. He wondered what that would encompass. He used to love thinking about the future. Now, he couldn't stand it. His mind drifted to the past. He didn't know what he was expecting that day, showing up at the Yuki estate unannounced. Perhaps it was worse that it was him that showed up, rather than his unexpectedness. He wasn't expecting to be beaten to death by his father, however. He found himself angry, a rare occurrence, though it quickly drifted to tears. He felt betrayed and hurt, though those words did little to capture the true scope of his turmoil. Arguably worse, he found himself feeling those things because he found himself still loving his father. His heart betrayed him, because how could he ever love the man who'd so irreparably hurt him? And then he realized just how badly he wanted his father to love him. And then he realized just how badly he wanted his father to love him still. And then he realized just how badly he wanted to walk back to the Yuki estate just to beg his father for the ancient feeling of a hug. And then he realized just what had brought him to the Yuki estate the first time. He remembered seeing his mother just before he blacked out. He remembered seeing his mother turn away just before he blacked out. Kimura felt that maybe he should hate her too, but he loved her. He missed the nights she would hold him and promise that everything would be all right. He missed her embrace, such an alien concept for him now. He missed the way she would brush away his tears and kiss his forehead, just below his ashen blonde hair. His tears rolled down his face now, with no one to brush them away for him. He missed feeling loved, even if he had tricked himself into believing it. Most of all, he missed not being alone. He was terribly alone now. He drew the curtains, not wanting anyone outside to look back and wonder all the things he wondered about them. "You have been slacking." The distinct voice of the between filled his head. He thought he would have been more excited to finally hear from one of them after so long, but instead, Kimura just felt as lonely as before. "So many souls here on the brink of expiration," the above chimed in a melancholy chord. "Are you so heartless as to leave them all to rot?" Kimura wished he was heartless. He wished that so desperately. Maybe not having a heart at all would save him from this excruciating pain. "You were chosen by us. We do not make mistakes." The below spoke matter-of-factly. "You must continue. It is your duty." How could he? How could he continue when the past was agonizing and the future was meaningless? How could he continue when he wanted nothing more than the time to stop around him so he could just rot his century away in a sorrow he knew? Tears slipped free from his eyes again, just when he'd managed to stop. But he was holding back an avalanche with his bare hands, and he could not bring himself to care as he sobbed again, just with new company. I cannot, it hurts so much." Kimura gripped at his chest, wishing he could reach right in and tear out the source of all his problems. He only then noticed how the room was aglow with the light of awaiting souls. He didn't realize he'd summoned them. He didn't think he had, though. He had no clue if they could be summoned for them. He tried to hide his face with his stature, shrinking in on himself. He didn't want to see them. Some of the dim souls floated faintly towards him, almost to try and comfort him, or maybe to beg him to reunite them with their loved ones already. Kimura didn't know. He didn't care. They came closer to him, and he cruelly pushed them away. "I cannot do it again. I cannot do this again where the chance exists that it could be my mother, or even my father, or anyone else my heart chooses to hold dearly, the next time I see them. It cannot be like this. I cannot survive another. I wish I had not survived the first." For once, none of the three knew what to do as Kimura's wrenching sobs filled the empty space. It hurts so much. I cannot do it again." His voice crumbled to a hoarse whisper. Please do not make me do it again." He sank from his spot by the window, his head held in his hands as the rest of him melted away. He felt so lifeless, like an empty shell, light and airy and untethered from the earth, like someone had scooped him hollow. And yet, the spot where his heart lay ached unforgivingly, a dull, unignorable throb that haunted him like the echoes of a ravine. It was a cruel juxtaposition in many unimaginable ways, and only now as he suffered did Kimura wish so desperately that he could just be one or the other. His face was scooped into hands, and Kimura recognized them as the aboves. Still, his tears did not stop, and still, they were not brushed away. "Oh, poor creation, we did not choose you lightly. You are ours, you must." The above drifted back, their fingers falling from his face. "There exists worse pain. This is conquerable. There is a reason we do not bestow even our most beloved creations with all sight." The other two looked between themselves, and then quickly to the above. Kimura naively did not notice a thing in his perplexity. All sight. The above did not continue, instead looking almost slyly to the between, who took barely a moment before stepping forward. "Our gaze reaches all. There is nothing that escapes us. The future is fixed and inconsequential. That is all sight. Kimura's tears finally slowed as his eyes furrowed in confusion instead. I do not understand. He turned back to the above. That is bad. The above sighed and shook their head, smothering a hint of laughter. But just as they moved to continue, the below moved forward instead, to the hidden surprise of both the above and the between. Even for our most beloved creation such as you, death is seen as is. There is no abruptness in all sight, only what will. Kimura wasn't smart, not by any real means, but even he knew what that meant, lurching forward on his knees like a dog. You know. The between brushed his face in a passing touch, leaving Kimura starving and reaching for more. Indeed, such is the burden we bear. Kimura gaped like a fish out of the water, gasping for breath as it flowed shakily into his lungs, starved of air and rationale, yet full of desperation and ache. He did the only thing he knew how. He begged. Please, I wish to see as well. I wish to be spared this cruel feeling. I need to know. He hung his head, greasy white hair falling in front of his eyes, perfectly blocking the shared, collusive glance of the three before him. You wish for all sight, even upon knowing the truth? What a peculiar thing you are, beloved creation. The above clicked their teeth, patronizingly, the smile audible in their voice. We are uncertain. All sight is a great power for a simple mortal, and we have already given you so much. Please, I ask for nothing else ever, and I will give you anything in return. The words felt hopelessly familiar on Kimura's tongue, heavy on his heart like a set of chains. I will yearn for no one again, just those who already have bound me by my heart. All I wish for is a chance to part peacefully, and I give you my life of servitude in exchange, 5 times even. He'd almost made the same mistake again, forgetting how worthless of a thing just his life was to offer. The above tapped at their chin in playful thought. Well, we will grant you your wish. The above and the between couldn't hide their shock this time, their gaze snapping to the below instinctively. The other did not respond, or even bother to face them, towering over Kimura's prone form with the glint of a predator's eye. Even through our careful selection, all of our other creations have only ever asked for their loved ones to be spared. To have a death so accepting of reality is refreshing. The below spoke sternly, and yet Kimura heard no resentment in their voice like he expected. Instead, he could have swore he heard something like eagerness laced underneath their solemnity. There are no qualms in granting your wish. All sight can simply be seized as it can be gifted, should you do something to warrant such an action. Kimura realized the below was no longer speaking to him, but rather the other two, who took a moment of silent thought at their counterparts' words. The moment couldn't be longer for him. Still kneeling at their feet, hands clasped in desperation, heart hammering about his ears. The moment couldn't be longer for him, hopelessly hoping for the first reprieve in his miserable life. There had never been a longer moment in his life, and he doubted there ever would be. The three then turned to him. Very well, they all spoke in unison, a conglomerate echo that Kimura's ears struggled to grasp as any particular voice, or even a voice at all. It has been done. Kimura waited a moment, still on his knees, before looking around nervously. I do not feel any. Pain erupted from the back of his skull. Completely unprepared, he winced, a grating yelp escaping his throat as he clutched at his head. It felt too full, too much, like there somehow wasn't enough room in the vast emptiness of his head. His hands turned to claws, scraping frantically at his skin for some sort of reprieve as his body hunched over in an attempt to steady his drunken swaying. Only when his chin pressed against his chest did he feel the vibrations coming from his throat. Was he screaming? He couldn't hear anything over the relentless buzzing that filled his ears. He couldn't hear. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. He stilled as his body collapsed, lying dormant on the hardwood floor. Pitiful shakes ran up and down his bones as his eyes remained stuck in place, locked in a pained, 1,000-yard stare. His mouth was left gaping, gasping for breath, but Kimura could do little else but exist, unable to get his body to respond at all as the buzzing slowly began to fade from his ears. "You surprised me. I did not know you had it in you still." He couldn't see, but Kimura recognized the voice's sickly sweet charm as the above. "You rarely participate." "It used to be entertaining, but you are too impatient, both of you." Kimura struggled to focus, but after a second he was able to place the below's smooth, monotonous voice. "You went too fast with this one. Again." "I did not expect it to break so soon." Kimura knew the unforgiving bluntness easily as the between, even as he fought to remain conscious. He thought he heard more words, but his scrambled brain wasn't able to understand them. "No matter." He couldn't tell whose voice that was, not over the laughter. Wait, who was laughing? He couldn't tell. Everything was slipping away from him. "We fixed it." He tried to will his own voice to speak, to call for help, to do anything, but even if he was talking, he couldn't tell over the resonating laughter. It was too much, too loud, too quickly. It was just enough to finally send him over the edge. Kimura blacked out. Gami woke up. It was still loud. The mall was full, more so than usual. There were so many people around them, he couldn't see them. Who was... "Maybe we'll have to move somewhere more private. I'd hate for us to get interrupted." Everything came back to him at once. Shigaraki was here. He had been here, and he had... Midoriya. He needed to get back to Midoriya. He lurched his wispy form forward, desperate to get back to his... Something violently yanked Gami back, the swarming colors of the frantic mall fading to the void. Bustling sounds dwindling to nothing more than the ghost-heavy breathing. He spun around, only finding incomprehensible shadows around him. Where was he? Damn it. He needed to get back to Midoriya. He'd been away from him for far too long already. Who knows what could have happened since then? Instead, he'd been trapped here in a stupid fucking memory... Someone stood at the edge of his mind. Gami recognized him immediately. "You!" Gami roared, storming towards him. "I have had enough of your game. I have tolerated far more than I should have. Let me leave." The person was unbothered by the screaming spirit in his face, his tired eyes blankly staring forward. "You are a fool," Kimura muttered with disdain. "I despise the fact we are truly the same soul." Gami grew enraged, biting his jaw to try to keep the venom from spewing out. It was unsuccessful. "I am not you. I have seen the things you have done, and they are despicable. Your efforts to sway me have elicited no pity. No man with any dignity would willingly admit to such atrocities." "I could not be bothered to care. Think whatever naive ideas you wish about humanity." Kimura brushed off his malice with an indifferent shrug, before his posture finally snapped to something serious. "But I refuse to be wiped away again." Kimura stepped forward. Gami refused to step back. "As things revert to how they should be, they will come for me again. They will come for you next, then your boy, then for any else that defy them. There is no safety in feasting on lies." Gami pointed to the man accusingly, his bony finger arched in a threatening strike. "It is you who thinks they are lies. All the strange things I have been feeling lately have been you, not me. If you truly feel that way, then so be it. It is expected of a man like you, but I refuse to be involved in the crusade you have committed to." Unexpectedly, Kimura seethed, fervor returning to his cold, lifeless eyes. "You fool. It is already too late. You have been involved ever since you refused to pass on. You thought you could cheat the system as I tried. We are the same." He snarled, jabbing a hand into the ghost's chest. Surprisingly, it didn't phase through, instead landing with all the harshness as intended. "And yet you choose to fight me so vigorously over things you refuse to understand. You are the reason we both grow weaker. You are the reason why my all-sight failed to protect your precious child." Gami paused. All-sight? Failed? Midoriya's premonitions. They'd been getting interrupted since the past couple of days. It was only just recently that he finally had the vision that had been delayed for so long, an amalgamation of all the visions he'd failed to have. Surely it couldn't be. Surely Kimura couldn't be saying, "It was you! You were the one tampering with Izuku's premonitions!" Kimura chuckled despondently. Of course you would think that. You refuse to listen, to understand. Your will is scattered. All sight does not belong to him. It belongs to this soul. You have been the one hindering your boy and yourself. Gami reeled back, finally noticing how shaky his form had become, nearly melting into the shadows of his own mind. No. No, you are lying. You spout falsehoods, as you always have. He moved further away from Kimura, step by step, until he finally worked up the courage to turn tail and run. He needed to get out of here. He needed to find Midoriya. So many terrible things had happened. He was sure his poor child was scared and alone. He was scared and alone. He needed to get back. The same sensation yanked him back again. This time, Gami fought back hysterically, but he found himself even more restricted than before, unable to move his limbs. He growled and thrashed like a rabid animal, but he found no more freedom than before. His efforts slowed as he tired, feeling much weaker than he ever had, as slow footsteps echoed towards him. I have fought tirelessly, against all odds, since your very waking thoughts to return to existence. I do not care about you or your child, but I refuse to be thwarted by your stupidity after coming all this way. Gami seized as the back of his head was suddenly grabbed, long fingers wrapping around his hood like the legs of a spider. The shadows of his mind began to melt away, replaced by the colors and memories of another. You will know the truth, whether you wish to or not. All Gami could do was apologize silently, as he lost himself once again. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 50 to Deku and Death. Chapter 51 will be up next. This was a lengthy one, probably the longest chapter I've done in a hot minute as far as timing goes. I'm curious to hear what you all thought about this one. In case there was any confusion, I know it's mentioned there at the end, but this whole chapter, like while this flashback is occurring, is taking place in real-time events while the mall situation is going on. So it's while Gami was unresponsive and Midoriya was trying to get his attention and the whole struggle with Shigaraki was taking place and Gami was like filtering in and out. So that's like time frame wise. So I really thought it was cool that the author had all this going on in the background of some of the real-time events too. So please drop your thoughts in those comments below. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.